Welcome to Globe Watch with me, Charles Ebune, inside the embassy of the State of Israel here in Yaoundé, Cameroon today. A complex man in a complex region, in a complex country, surrounded by complex neighbors with complex issues in complex circumstances with complex people in a world which is simply complex. So can be summed the life of former Israeli President Shimon Peres, who died this week at the age of 93. By 2014, he was the world's oldest serving head of state and was in Cameroon in the 1980s as the only Israeli prime minister to have visited Cameroon. So, who will be missing Shimon Peres, who has been described by many, including US President Barack Obama, as a light in the world of the peace construction process. In his first major television interview in Cameroon, the Israeli ambassador to Cameroon exclusively reflects on the life of his former president. With me today on Globe Watch. Ambassador Rand Gido, welcome to Globe Watch.
Thank you very much.
Any personal connections with Shimon Peres in your life?
Quite a few. My father used to know Mr. Peres when Mr. Peres served as defense minister in the 1970s, and my father played a significant role in the development of the Israeli defense sector. But personally, I joined the diplomatic service 21 years ago when Mr. Peres was the foreign minister, and he took a very personal approach. And I remember when we graduated from the diplomatic academy, Foreign Minister Peres, he was already famous all over the world. He had won the Nobel Prize for Peace, and yet he found the time to come to our graduation ceremony and shake each individual candidate's hand and ask a few personal questions about our ambitions and our plans. Later on, as a diplomat, I was posted to Georgia, I was posted to China, I was posted to London. Each posting, I had the privilege and the honor to host Mr. Peres, either as prime minister or as president or as foreign minister. So I've had many opportunities to benefit from his experience and wisdom.
In those encounters, Barack Obama has described him as a light which has gone off in the entire global peace process. In such different encounters you had with him, what did you discuss with him in particular, and what fond memories do you have of him?
First of all, on a personal level, I can tell you that Mr. Shimon Peres belonged to this caliber of world leaders who seem to be made differently than ordinary human beings, like Margaret Thatcher, for example. He was famous for his superhuman capability or ability for work. I remember when he came to Beijing, I was a junior diplomat in the Israeli embassy in Beijing. He had covered 6 countries in 5 days, and he was already 80 years old. We took him out in Beijing for dinner. Around 1 o'clock in the morning, all of us were completely dead with exhaustion, but Mr. Peres could go on forever. Finally, he said, "It's okay, I feel sorry for you. I can see that all of you are tired. Why don't you take me back to the hotel, but make sure you wake me up at 6 o'clock in the morning with the morning papers." Also, it was absolutely incredible to listen to his anecdotes about people that he'd met, people like Churchill, like de Gaulle. Mr. Peres met JFK, President Kennedy, when President Obama was 1 year old. So he was a true giant of not only Israeli politics, but world history.
Absolutely, a giant of world history, and that is why world leaders, including Pope Francis, German Chancellor Angela Merkel, President Barack Obama, Democratic presidential hopeful Hillary Clinton, with whom they signed the 1993 Oslo Accords when the husband, Bill Clinton, was president. And we'll be talking about that in a moment. Shimon Peres served twice as interim prime minister of Israel, served twice as prime minister of Israel On several occasions, he was Foreign Affairs Minister, and for 7 years, he was President of the State of Israel between 2007 and 2014, making him the oldest 7 head of state in the world at the age of 19. What did he particularly tell you young Israelis about the foundation of the State of Israel in 1948, including Ben-Gurion, your first leader?
Mr. Peres started his career as a hawk. He started it as someone very much committed to the security and defense of the State of Israel. But that was a different generation. That was the generation of 1948, the founding fathers of the State of Israel, when we had to fight for our existence and survival. Gradually, over the years, he moved further to the left, and he became convinced that what is required for our survival is not just a strong army, or not just very advanced military technology, but proactive policy and diplomacy in order to achieve peace. And he devoted the last 25 years of his life in order to achieve peace. So his 3 key messages to the young Israeli population, or to the youth of Israel, were: 1, peace is just as essential for the country's prosperity and security as a strong army. Secondly, the most important asset any nation can have is not natural resources, not oil and gas or aluminum or metals, but the youth. The youth of each nation is the most important strategic asset. And the third key message is education and science. Mr. Peres discovered nanotechnology when he turned 89, I think. And he was passionate about nanotechnology. Even people who are, in their early 20s have barely heard about nanotechnology. Yet there we have a man who won the Nobel Prize, who met Churchill, who met de Gaulle, who met JFK, and is passionately pushing for nanotechnology at the age of 90.
You just spoke that he met JF Kennedy, and I want to mention that Shimon Peres concluded the first military equipment sale between the United States of America and Israel back in 1963 in the famous air anti-craft missile deal. This is somebody who was called by many and described himself as the Hulk of Israel, and was the Director General for the Defense in the 1950s, served in the first Knesset in 1959. I just wonder why so many hail him as a peacemaker when in reality he was the one to deliver the nuclear military capability of Israel.
Well, many people indeed pose this question. This is a very good question and a very difficult question. And many people pose this question to Peres himself when he was still alive. After all, he won the Nobel Prize for Peace. And his reply was that you can only make peace when you feel that you are strong enough and confident enough to make peace. So the first half of his life was devoted to making Israel strong and confident. Only once we achieved that stage could he then move on to the second phase, and that is making
Israel
peace.
the military superpower of the Middle East. Was that his real intention?
Absolutely, right from the start.
And do you think that purpose was achieved when, in reality, later in his life, he won the Nobel Prize, Peace, and so many other issues, but you are very much aware that he's the one who began the settlement process, which they call today Israeli occupation of Palestinian territories. Why this life of contradiction?
I think every true leader, every great man or person or woman, every great person of politics is riddled with contradictions. The same has been said about Churchill, the same has been said about every world leader. These are, you started off your presentation by pointing to the complexity of the situation and the complexity of Mr. Peres, and that's absolutely spot on. Yes, I'm sure there were many moments in his life when he had to take decisions that were controversial, and perhaps later on, with the benefit of hindsight, maybe, I don't know, maybe he would have made different choices. But nobody can take away from Mr. Peres the fact that he was a pillar first in the defense of Israel, and secondly in Israel's pursuit for peace. Now, you have to realize, and I'm sure you do, Israel is a tiny little country. We have a population of about 8.5 million people. That's a third of the Cameroonian population. The size of Israel is only a fraction of Cameroon, okay? However, we are surrounded...
Roughly the southwest region of Cameroon.
Absolutely, absolutely. We are tiny, absolutely tiny. However, we are surrounded by giants. We are surrounded by Saudi Arabia, by Egypt, by Jordan, by Iran, by Iraq, countries that are enormous with a huge population. Therefore, Israel had to make sure from day one that we would not be wiped out from the face of the earth. You have to remember that the State of Israel was established by Holocaust survivors, refugees who survived the Holocaust.
Well, he himself was born in Poland in 1923 and only came into Israel through immigration because of the Jewish diaspora community through the Balfour Declaration of 1917, which later established British Palestine. But the question I want to put to you today is that, technically speaking, the 1993 Oslo Accords, which were the first peace deal between Israel and the Palestinians, was technically a production of Shimon Peres and the current president of the Palestinian Authority, Mahmoud Abbas, or Abu Mazen. Do you think that with the death of Shimon Peres, the peace process is equally dead? Of course, it's been in the shelf over the years now.
The peace process has had its ups and downs, but we have to remember that the conflict between the Palestinians and the Israelis started a century ago, over a century ago. When you compare it to other long-lasting conflicts around the world, for example, the one in Northern Ireland, it's been going on for 800 years. So I think, you know, there were some optimists in '93 when the Oslo peace process started who expected everything to be over, everything to be, you know, signed and done with in 5 years. Now, with the benefit of hindsight, it was probably a little bit naive. It's very difficult to solve a conflict that has lasted for over a century in just a few years. Yes, you're absolutely right. For the past few years, we have seen a lull, an ongoing crisis. But if you look at opinion polls, both on the Palestinian side and the Israeli side, they are very revealing. What they reveal is that the majority of people, both Palestinians and Israelis, want peace passionately. However, they mistrust the other side. So we need to overcome this barrier of suspicion and mistrust. This is primarily an issue of psychology, not of national interest. If we overcome this barrier of psychology, of mistrust, then I'm confident that we can move on. And in a way, you know, the fact that Mr. Peres passed away 2 days ago gives us an opportunity to refresh his message, to refresh his heritage. And now there are many publications, many articles, many interviews, both in the Israeli media and the world media, about his heritage of peace. So maybe that will galvanize, maybe this will inject the peace process with a fresh momentum.
Who do you think is going to miss Shimon Peres? Because the Palestinians see him as somebody who orchestrated the settlement, which has led to the death of so many Palestinian children. Who will be missing Shimon Peres? Israel, Palestinians, the world, individuals, just the family?
I think if you look at the long list of world leaders in Jerusalem, that will give you a very good indication as to how much he's going to be missed by people all over the world. We have people like former President Clinton, former Prime Minister Tony Blair, current President of the United States, Obama, and many others, President Putin of Russia, and a long list of people, the Pope, who have called him my personal friend or my mentor. He will be missed by many people. And I have to flag up, I have to say that I was personally moved to hear that the president of the Palestinian Authority, Mahmoud Abbas, President Abu Mazen, sent a personal message of condolences to Mr. Peres' family. So that is a good indication. Despite everything you said, which is absolutely true, he was considered a controversial figure amongst Palestinians. The leader of the Palestinians is sending a personal message of condolences. This is the true heritage of Mr. Peres.
Absolutely a true heritage. And the follow-up question is, what particular legacy is Shimon Peres leaving? He once described peace as a romantic process, just like love, in which you must take both sides into consideration. He once described himself as a hawk. Former U.S. President George Walker Bush has described him as a personal friend, as somebody so committed to peace, and you can go on and on and on such kind of declarations. What is the particular legacy he's leaving, not just for the Middle East peace process, but for global tranquility? As you know, he lost elections in 1996 to Benjamin Netanyahu, who is the current prime minister, and this is a hardliner.
If I had to distill the personal message, the long-lasting message of Mr. Peres, I would choose one word, and that is optimism. He was renowned, he was famous for his witticisms. He is like, he's in the tradition of Mr. Churchill, Oscar Wilde, George Bernard Shaw, that in the future, international dictionaries of quotations will include many famous sayings by Mr. Peres. But two of my favorite ones that will answer your question. One, he said that the peace process between Israel and the Palestinians involves not so much the challenge of not seeing the light at the end of the tunnel. We see the light, it is the tunnel that we don't see. In other words, we know what the future solution is going to be like. What we don't see is the process leading to there. His other saying was that optimists and pessimists die the same kind of death, but they have completely different kind of life. Therefore, he chose to be an optimist. And despite all the upheavals and challenges, and sometimes he lost general elections, as you pointed out, he never gave up the hope and the optimism. This was also the message that he brought with him as Prime Minister of Israel when he visited Cameroon in 1986, exactly 30 years ago, in order to re-establish our bilateral diplomatic relations after a period of 10 years of suspension.
You just spoke about Cameroon, and Shimon Peres was here roughly 21 days before I was born in 1986. There is this controversy between Israel and Cameroon during the visit of Shimon Peres in 1986 in the country over the Lake Nyos disaster. We didn't have the chance to ask him that question, and I want to put it to you as an Israeli diplomat. I'm doing my job as a journalist. Mm-hmm. What actually went wrong?
I think this was a case of an ill-founded conspiracy theory that was never proved by any serious observer or researcher or analyst. It was some kind of a strange rumor that was propagated by some members of the media, I suppose. But I don't think any serious observer would have supposed for a moment that if Israel had been associated in any way, direct or indirect, to that terrible catastrophe, the Cameroonian government would not have pursued the kind of positive, fruitful relationship that we have been enjoying for 3 decades. In fact, I've heard on numerous occasions from senior Cameroonian leaders that they consider Israel, and for good reason, as an intimate partner of Cameroon. And I think this reflects truly this genuine state of affairs between our two countries.
Shimon Peres is probably the only Israeli prime minister to have visited Cameroon. What will Cameroon be missing in particular following his death? What kind of bond of relationship did he establish between Cameroon and Israel that we will always remember him throughout life?
Mr. Peres put a huge stress on developing our links with Africa, and especially West Africa and Central Africa. This is not to be taken for granted. I know that Cameroon is a bilingual country officially, and this interview is taking place in English. However, the fact of the matter is that maybe 80% of this country is more francophone than...
On aura le temps de faire une interview en français. Allez-y.
Avec plaisir.
OK.
For Israelis, it's much easier to develop bilateral links with East Africa. First of all, because they tend to speak English rather than French. Secondly, because of their geographical proximity. Thirdly, we have direct flights. Those three advantages are absent when it comes to Cameroon. The fact that Mr. Perez personally led the delegation here, he could have sent a junior minister, he could have sent the foreign minister, he could have sent many other civil servants, but the Prime Minister of Israel took the time and trouble to come here. That sent a very powerful message for the fact that we don't put all our eggs in one basket in the eastern side of the continent, but rather we think the potential is here on this side of the continent.
You know, one of the military exploits of the Israeli government was under the time of Shimon Peres as defense minister. You know, the sad events in 1976 in East Africa in which the brother of the current prime minister, Benjamin Netanyahu, died. They call it the Entebbe massacre. What were those military contributions of Shimon Peres to the security of Israel?
Mr. Peres made his contribution to the security and defense of Israel was almost impossible to assess because of its sheer magnitude. Mr. Peres was appointed Director General of the Ministry of Defense of Israel at the age of 30. Okay? He later went on to establish...
Some statistics hold 28, roughly in 1952.
I will not challenge that.
Okay.
Go ahead. Well, it's even more impressive.
Whatever the case, he was a young man, he was a youth.
He was a youth, absolutely.
Yeah.
And he pushed for the establishment of the Israeli military industries, which are on the front line of military industries in the world today. Only 2 weeks ago, we sent our 11th satellite into orbit. There are less than 10 countries in the world that can produce and launch independently satellites, and Israel is one of them, largely thanks to Mr. Peres. He also pushed for the creation of all kinds of strategic possibilities for the Israeli military in order to make sure that the Israeli defense is unshakable. You mentioned the Entebbe operation in 1976. He, jointly with Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin at the time, took the responsibility for the operation, which is a very, very courageous thing. If you think about it, we didn't have diplomatic relations with Uganda under Idi Amin at the time. Now, Israel launched, this is the 1970s, 40 years ago with 1970s kind of technology. Israel launched an operation all the way from Israel to Uganda in the middle of the night in order to save the lives of hundreds of hostages. There were any number of reasons for how the operation could have gone disastrously wrong, and it could have resulted not only in the death of the hostages, but the death of the Israeli rescuers. The fact that Shimon Peres as defense minister and Yitzhak Rabin as prime minister took the responsibility, that was a hugely courageous thing to do.
And finally, Mr. Ambassador, Shimon Peres, foreign minister, shared the Nobel Peace Prize in 1994 with his boss, Yitzhak Rabin, who was assassinated later for the Oslo Peace Accords. This is somebody alongside Palestinian Authority President today, in those days, Yasser Arafat. This is somebody who was considered as a special man, especially in the relationship between the United States of America and Israel. And a few years ago, he was awarded the highest civilian distinction in the United States by President Barack Obama, what they called the Congressional Medal of Freedom. Do you think that people like UC Belen, who was with him during the peace process in the 1990s, can deliver the two-state solution, which he has not seen?
This is a very difficult question, which involves a degree of speculation. You know, if anyone had tried to spot which Israeli leaders and politicians would be able to deliver peace in the 1970s and 80s, I don't think many people would have pointed to Shimon Peres, because as you said yourself before, he used to be a hawk. He used to be Mr. Defense, Mr. Security, and yet he reinvented himself as a leader of the peace movement. So when we look around us now, it's very difficult to speculate and point to the person who could resurrect the peace process. It could be our current prime minister, precisely because he's considered a hardliner. So maybe that means that he can also deliver peace. I don't know, but I am choosing to adopt the message of Shimon Peres and remain an optimist, because as I said before, the most important fact is that the overwhelming majority of Palestinians and overwhelming majority of Israelis want peace. So finding the two leaders to lead them to peace should be, at least in theory, an easy thing.
The Israeli ambassador to Cameroon, Ran Gideon, thank you very much indeed for granting your first major television interview in Cameroon to Globewatch and to the Cameroon Radio Television.
Thank you. My pleasure.
You're welcome.